For the first time in nearly 6 months, kids across Florida have the option to head back into the classroom. But the first day of school looks very different this year. NBC News correspondent Kerry Sanders joins me now from Charlotte County, Florida. Kerry, tell us, what is the first day of school looking like right now?
Well, an exciting day for kids. Most of them are now getting out of school at this hour. They all either got their parents to bring them to school, took school buses, but bottom line is they're all wearing masks. But for those kids who've now arrived at schools without masks, the state of Florida, the Department of Education, has acquired more than 10 million masks to give the kids. It's all about teaching them what they've heard from their parents all along here about making sure they wash their hands, they understand what social distancing is. In some cases, the schools have set up partitions on the desks to have a little added space to protect each other. But bottom line now, every school in the state of Florida is now open, whether it's bricks and mortar kids going to classroom or virtual, but every school is now open in all 67 counties.
Well, you just mentioned it. Some of that is virtual, though. In fact, thousands of students are staying remote for the start of the year, but there's some difficulties there, and some of those kids are already running into problems. Tell us what you've heard.
Well, about 60% of the kids are going into the classroom, 40% doing virtual. But in some counties like Miami-Dade County, it's 100% virtual. And today was a fail. The kids all got their 360,000 kids with their computers, many of them having their computers issued to them on the internet. The internet apparently robust enough to hold everything. And so the kids were able to dial in, more or less, as you'd say, with their computers. But once they got to the system crashed and could not come up. In fact, kids discovering that repeated tries did them no success. And I guess if there's one little upside here, at the end of the day, all the students at Miami-Dade were notified by the superintendent that today would not be considered a lost day that they now have to make up. Why did this all happen? Well, according to the officials and the experts in the IT department at the Miami-Dade schools, they say this was not a case of hardware, this was software, and it had something to do with the code. And all I can say is, as an average person who uses the computer every day, when I hear it's something to do with the code, kind of raise your hands and you hope those experts can solve it ASAP.
You just say, who knows? And look, it's tough. It's a lot of kids logging on at once. Now, Kerry, this is kind of wild. A recent Miami Herald report says that the Florida Health Department accidentally released a report that found nearly 900 students and staff tested positive for COVID during a 2-week period in August as schools were reopening. What do you know about that? And are we hearing any reaction?
Well, this is really quite troubling because parents and school teachers would like to know the spread of coronavirus in the state. The Miami Herald had a reporter who was somewhat eagle-eyed and spotted on the health department website a report that was analyzing the number of coronavirus cases in the school systems in the state of Florida. We have 67 counties. But that report then was taken down almost as quickly as it went up. The reporter was able to get a screenshot of it, and so had some of the data from the report, which included 205 students and 342 staff members from primary and secondary schools, showing that they had coronavirus. This is information that's incredibly useful to parents dropping their kids off, but as I noted, also to the school teachers who are worried about exposure themselves. The governor says that it was inadvertently posted, it was only partial information, and that it lacks context, and that it will eventually all be placed on the website for people to make their own decisions. But for instance, here in Charlotte County, today's the first day of school. It's the kind of information parents could use, as well as teachers. And as you know, the union in the state of Florida is suing the governor who forced the schools to open on a schedule that many of the teachers felt was perhaps too rushed and less scientific than it should be. And now they're responding to what was posted by the Miami Herald in that, what the governor calls inadvertent report. This is what the union president had to say.
We knew that this would be the end result of rushing to open our schools. We knew that, what the small amount of history had taught us is that these are going to be community spread events, that schools are going to create super spread events. And so there was no, we had no surprise there. But what we unfortunately are up against here in Florida is a governor who does not want to be transparent. As you know, that report was up and then they pulled it down.
And so a lot of concern, again, the governor's office saying that that information will eventually be available, but for many parents, they would like to have it now. All the schools open in the state of Florida, a lot of eyes and attention on coronavirus. But whether this ultimately works with all the schools open is sort of a test in progress. And we're waiting to find out whether this is a super spreading event, as we've seen, especially on college campuses, or whether Florida will be able to maintain, with the protocols that they put in place, the spread of coronavirus among children. And let's not forget, kids come and go, and even if they are less susceptible for long-term or serious illness from coronavirus, they come and go at the house. They come home to their parents. Sometimes grandparents are living in the house. It's the potential here that is the most concern and the most attention on what potentially could happen.
Absolutely. Kerry, I'm with some of those parents. Eventually is a little too late if the first day of school for a lot of kids in person is today. Thanks so much for that reporting. And thanks for getting to the bottom of that coding issue for us, Kerry.
No problem.
The race is on to find a coronavirus vaccine. FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn said he's willing to fast-track the authorization of a vaccine before phase 3 trials end. This could mean we see a vaccine before the end of the year. NBC News medical correspondent Dr. John Torres joins me now. All right, Dr. John, what's this FDA emergency authorization process look like? How fast exactly is it going? What are they going to miss out on?
And Savannah, it can get very confusing because this isn't something that we've seen, most of us, at least in our lifetime. But the FDA typically does what they call an approval process. And drugs, vaccines, they'll go through 3 different human phase trials after they've already gone through animal trials. In between each trial, a lot of data analysis, a lot of number crunching, and then you start the other trial. And then typically what happens is once they get through those trials, then they'll look at the approval process. This can take years. On average for vaccines, around 11 years. Well, now we have a pandemic, so push forward to 2020, they're saying, we don't have time for that. So let's use this emergency use authorization. And what happens here, instead of doing the robust trials and studies and data analysis they say, we need to look at it from a point of view, do the benefits outweigh the risks? In other words, we have something bad going on right now, the coronavirus pandemic. We need a vaccine. Is there a way we can bridge that gap, at least temporarily, using this emergency use authorization? It's a temporary measure. But what they do is they look at these trials, but they typically still go through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of these trials. And then at the end, they crunch the numbers and they say, okay, let's give them this authorization. But now Dr. Hahn is saying, we're going to look at it earlier on because there might be certain populations, as in healthcare workers or those pre-existing conditions, who might be able to use it based on this emergency use authorization. But the rest of the population will have to wait a little bit until we get a little more data, Savannah.
So what typically happens during phase 3 trials of a vaccine? And if this would sort of cut into that, is it enough to prove it's safe?
So that's a great question. And the phase 3 is the robust one that takes the longest period of time. So phase 1, usually around 30 people or so, healthy young adults, to make sure it's safe and a little bit to look at its effectiveness. Phase 2 uses more people, around 300 adults, and they look to see if it's safe and effective in that group. And then they transition to phase 3. Phase 3, in this case, in some of them, it's 30,000 adults, half get the vaccine, half get a placebo. They want to make sure they have a whole spectrum of society. So they look at people 18 to 65, some are looking at age 80, and then they look at different ethnicities, people with pre-existing medical conditions. They're trying to mimic what happens in a population and who might get it. They study them for longer periods of time to make sure it's effective. That's one of the big things. And of course, to make sure it's safe as well. And what they're saying here is that partway through the trial, we can look at its effectiveness and we can get an idea that it's pretty safe, that it looks like it's working, it's effective, and we can start using it on those vulnerable populations I was talking about. Others are saying we want to make sure we have to be very careful we're not making any political decisions here. So we should have an independent panel that looks at the data, not necessarily the FDA or a government panel, to make recommendations. So that way everybody has an understanding that there's no politics involved here, Savannah.
And so, Dr. John, what do you say to people who are concerned about getting the vaccine once we have one? And then I think also just a little bit more specifically with what we're talking about here, for someone who might be all for a vaccine but thinks, hey, they didn't really fully complete the trial. Is this okay? Should I do it? What do you think?
And it all comes down, Savannah, to a risk versus benefit. And the benefit here, especially if you're in a situation where you're more likely to get coronavirus, you're a healthcare worker, you're an essential worker who has to be in constant contact, you can't necessarily social distance. You want to be careful because this vaccine might actually be helpful, and look at it and primarily make sure it's safe. We're going to come out with more information over the next couple of months. I'll be talking to you guys constantly about what we're seeing and what's happening out there. And that's why an independent panel like this would be very helpful, because I think give people the confidence that they're making it based on science and data and not on politics, which the FDA says they're going to do. But I think people might get a misunderstanding there and think that they're getting a lot of pressure from the government. So, kind of look at the data, look at what's happening over the next few months, and look at what they say as to who should be getting it. Again, initially, it's not going to be the general public. It's going to be those that need it at that point, and then eventually the general public. But understand there's going to be a variety of vaccines coming out. They're not all going to be working the same way. And so we'll get a better understanding as time goes on, especially on which ones will be coming out first and which ones will be available to us and to people in the general population, Savannah.
Dr. John, we are lucky that you will be talking to us constantly through this time, because this is all very tough to understand,
very confusing.
And we need you. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.